Coming up in this episode, we're going to continue our overview of text adventure games from the 1980s by seeing how Scott Adams and Adventure International, Digital Fantasia, and Beam Software had a powerful influence on the UK, Europe, and Australia when it came to text-based adventure games. We'll also talk about companies like Level 9 Computing and Magnetic Scrolls, creators of some of the best text-based adventure games not made by Infocom. We'll cover Eamon and the Quill and other software that allowed gamers to create their own text-based adventures. We'll close by talking about modern interpreters like Fraughts and CADs, and we'll even talk briefly about genre cousins, multi-user dungeons. I'm Sean Jordan, and I am your Great Game Guide. Let's continue on our exploration of text-based adventure games from the 1980s. The history of game development is rife with what some people might call extreme flattery in the form of imitation, and what others might call outright theft of ideas. There's probably a middle ground between these two extremes that accurately describes a lot of what happens, but when someone steals your idea and becomes successful in their own right, it's a pretty rotten feeling. I should know, it happened to me. When I was 16 and in high school in the mid-1990s, I had a TI-85 graphing calculator that I wrote games for using the included BASIC language. And I spent a lot of time working on this dungeon crawling game that allowed you to wander around a randomized maze in an 8x8 grid and retrieve treasure using traditional text-based adventure inputs to move in cardinal directions, as well as pick up or equip items and battle monsters. I did some really clever stuff too, like expanding the grid by using matrix algebra to store the information for each room and creating varied probability ranges to make the combat more exciting, depending on the description of the monster. What can I say? I wrote a lot of this in my Algebra 2 class when I was bored, so I was applying what I was learning to my game. Unfortunately, I couldn't encrypt my source code. Anyone who downloaded the game could go in and edit the basic code themselves. And while I took some measures to mask some of the ideas I was proudest of and built in some rudimentary protection checks to deter fiddling with my code, it was still pretty trivial for anyone who copied my game to go into the code and make changes. So I put a note in the game's title screen that it had been created by me and not to change it. And you can guess what happened. Another student decided to improve it with his own alterations and then give himself a co-credit on the title screen. He didn't have to come up with any of the clever stuff to make the game work. He just had to mess with my code and add in his own ideas. I remember telling him to stop, and his attitude was pretty much what you'd expect. He kept on doing what he wanted, and before long, his version was the more popular of the two. Now, there was no money involved here. No one was profiting off this free game that I'd made, and his version and my version were competing for exactly one thing: players. So, when I started complaining about how he copied me to what I assumed would be sympathetic ears, what annoyed me most was that some of my friends thought his version was better. Not because he'd done any of the things needed to make it possible, but because his version broke some of my game's rules and, in their words, is just more fun. That was the last game I ever wrote in BASIC. No sense in letting people steal your hard work like that just so you can have your heart broken. But it's also a story you see happening over and over in the 1970s and early 1980s with computer gaming. Someone figures out how to do something clever and they share it with the world, only for others to take it and use it for their own purposes. And the history of game development is similar to many other forms of media in that many of the people who create the most foundational and important first efforts don't realize any of the actual financial success that the people who come after them see. For every Ken and Roberta Williams who made it big with their business savvy, you've got loads of people like Will Crowther and Don Woods who created something truly inspirational in the game adventure, but barely made a cent off the work. Steve Russell and his collaborators didn't make any money on the highly influential PDP-1 game Space War, but Nolan Bushnell copied the concept with Computer Space and wound up founding Atari, while other people copied the game whole cloth and sometimes even its name to build their own commercial versions. Walter Bright's Empire only sold 2 copies when he made it commercially available in 1983, and he wound up licensing the game to a developer called Interstel, who then created a deluxe edition that was a modest hit. A game developer at Microprose was a fan of Empire, though, and he was inspired to use some of its ideas in a 1990 game he created called Sid Meier's Civilization, which would go on to spawn one of the most prominent game series of all time. The team of Michael Toy, Glenn Wickman, and Ken Arnold struggled to commercialize their 1980 game Rogue because freeware copycat versions of their game, like Hack and Moria, managed to replicate many of the same ideas. Today, the roguelike is a huge subgenre of indie gaming and it has many offshoots of its own. But the original creators don't receive any royalties for any of it. They just get the satisfaction of knowing that they were the guys who came up with the idea in the first place. I mention all of this because as we return to our discussion of text-based adventure gaming, I want to bring up Scott Adams. No, not the Dilbert guy, but a savvy programmer who decided to make his own version of adventure for the TRS-80 computer called Adventureland. Now, I don't want to suggest that Scott Adams just copied Adventure and sold it, because that's not at all what happened. And besides, there were plenty of people who later ported Adventure to microcomputer platforms for free. Scott Adams initially wrote Adventureland as his own take on the concept, and while it's similar in style, it's also a game that largely takes place above ground rather than inside a series of caves, and its hunt for 13 treasures is far more straightforward than the quest in the original Adventure was. He also published the source code to Pirate's Adventure in Byte magazine in 1980 so that anyone could build their own adventure game, something that would come back to bite him later on. But Scott Adams did see the commercial potential for not just making more adventure games, but also porting them to different personal computer platforms. And so he and his wife Alexis founded a company called Adventure International and began churning out more than a dozen sequels that featured different settings. The aforementioned pirate adventures, along with secret missions and haunted castles and fun houses and pyramids and ghost towns and even outer space. But most of these games followed the same treasure-gathering formula, and gamers' interest in them wore off pretty quickly, particularly since the games were all text-based. And so Adventure International launched new versions called Scott Adams Graphic Adventures that included awesome painted box art and not quite so impressive in-game graphics. Seriously, these in-game graphics look like collections of early clip art, and often there's no consistent sense of design in any of the illustrations. You'll go from these somewhat helpful environmental pictures or detailed descriptions of items to these absolutely cartoony drawings of characters that look like they were drawn for children. It's not great, and it didn't impress people at the time either. Adventure International kept trying to push forward, though, and they had two big licensing deals that they thought were going to help them. The first was a deal with the filmmakers behind the 1984 adventure film, The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension, which features a Zen-spouting, supersonic jet car-driving neurosurgeon physicist who's also the lead guitarist in the new wave band the Hong Kong Cavaliers. Now, I love this incredibly stupid cult classic of a movie, but it's also rather notorious for being an unintelligible mess and a huge box office bomb. And the fact that Adventure International decided to make a tie-in text adventure game with graphics during the era of the video game crash tells you a lot about how either desperate or clueless they must have been around this time. The game itself is fine, but if you don't enjoy the movie, you're not going to find it too compelling as an adventure, especially in a competitive marketplace where a really good graphical adventure game adapting the feature film The Dark Crystal was also available on shelves. We'll get to that in a future episode. The second was a deal with Marvel Comics to create a new line of graphical adventure games under the imprint Quest Probe. The first game featured the Incredible Hulk, and two more installments followed, one featuring Spider-Man and another with the duo of Human Torch and The Thing. Now, I'll say this first of all, these games have a far better art design thanks to some excellent source artwork provided by Marvel Comics. But all three of them are still text adventures, and they all were rather primitive ones when they launched in 1985. They were also the last-ditch effort for Adventure International to keep its doors open. The publisher went bankrupt in 1986, and Scott Adams largely left the game industry, resurfacing a couple of times to try to launch new text-based adventure games, one in 2013 focused on a story built around the King James Bible, and the other as part of a failed 2016 series of games tied into Brian Jacques' excellent Redwall novels. But I will say this for Scott Adams, he knew how to craft a good puzzle, and that's probably his greatest legacy as an adventure game creator. While most of his games don't hold up today for their interactive fiction, they did help to inspire an entire generation of games that really do. And while our last episode focused on the North American text adventure scene, let's now turn our attention across the Atlantic to the UK and Europe, where Scott Adams' influence was felt quite strongly. I grew up in Ohio and Illinois in the United States, so I'm far from an expert on anything from the UK and Europe when it comes to gaming. The only reason I'm even a little bit savvy is because we lived in military communities where there were people who'd been stationed overseas and who had access to computers and software we didn't have here. But you can bet one thing nobody was showing off was their collection of text-based adventures. They just weren't as impressive as anything graphical. At the same time, text-based adventures were really common because they were relatively easy to write for any of the many competing personal computer formats, and also were fairly easy to keep small enough to fit on cassettes, low-density floppy disks, or cartridges. So most of what I know about text-based adventure games outside of the United States comes from spending a lot of time investigating and playing them over the last few years. I'm not even going to try to be comprehensive here. Instead, I want to start off by talking about a guy named Brian Howarth who was inspired enough by Scott Adams' text adventure games to create his own text-based adventure for the TRS-80 computer, a game released in 1981 called The Golden Baton. And when I say inspired, I mean he really took some serious cues from Scott Adams, because after The Golden Baton sold well enough for his publisher to demand more, Howarth created 2 more games for the TRS-80, then started his own company called Digital Fantasia to port his games more widely to other microcomputers. As it happened, he'd already been porting games for Adventure International's UK arm, and he built an adventure game interpreter of his own that was quite similar to Scott Adams' own program. In one interview, he claims that he and a non-programmer friend figured out how to use some software to edit Scott Adams' interpreter and run new code. But other sources say he used the source code Scott Adams had published in that 1980 issue of Byte magazine for Pirate's Adventure, which also seems to be plausible given the similarities between Howarth's games and Adventure International's. Remember, I told you that decision to publish this code would come back and bite Scott Adams, right? Despite the magazine including a note that the code was copywritten and only available for personal use, there was really no way for Scott Adams to stop someone else from using it. Now, this might seem fitting given that Scott Adams built his concept on Will Crowther and Don Woods' game, but like I said, Scott Adams didn't outright copy Adventure. He used the basic design and wrote his own code, puzzles, and scenarios. And Brian Howarth didn't outright copy Adventureland or Pirate's Adventure, but he did use Scott Adams' interpreter and database code to create versions of many of the titles in his own Mysterious Adventure series. Howarth's series had 11 games that were so popular that they had multiple print runs and wound up on just about every computer standard available in the UK. Howarth also ported the graphical version of Adventureland to platforms like the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum, and, surprise, surprise, used that opportunity to add graphics to new releases of his own games. But here's the thing. I might be painting him as a copycat, but Brian Howarth's games actually were quite a bit better than the Adventure International titles, and The Golden Baton, The Time Machine, both parts of Arrow of Death, and Perseus and Andromeda in particular are considered some of the finest text adventures of the era. And Escape from Pulsar 7 is a tense and nerve-wracking adventure clearly inspired by the movie Alien. And the other 5 games in the series are mostly worth playing, though the last of the bunch, Waxworks, is considered the weakest. By the way, no relation to the later game of the same name. But to Howarth's credit, it was published in 1983, and it's still a decent game for its time. And unlike Scott Adams, who would soon be shuttering Adventure International as text-based adventures largely went out of style, Howarth went on to work as a game developer for both PC and console games well into the 1990s. But you know what we haven't talked about yet that was going on in North America at this time? Bookware, that style of interactive fiction based on the works of famous authors. And as it happens, the UK's take on Bookware had some games based on one of the series of books that has had an enormous impact on adventure gaming, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. During the early 1980s, a publisher called Melbourne House was importing games into the UK and published a tremendous adventure game from Beam Software, their partner development studio in Australia. It was an adaptation of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. While this game did include graphics, it featured a sophisticated text parser that could interpret entire sentences instead of simple verb-noun arrangements. And it could even understand punctuation, adverbs, adjectives, and prepositional phrases. If you play The Hobbit today, and I really do recommend it, you'll notice right away that it's far more interesting than a lot of text-based adventures of its era, because it includes so many elements that lead to emergent gameplay. The game takes place in real time, advancing the world state at a set interval if you don't provide it with commands. NPCs like Gandalf and Thorin are free to walk around the game's world and pick up items, sometimes even off of you. And animals also move on their own, creating unexpected encounters that can really change the game with each playthrough. As you might expect from a game from 1982, however, the big ideas in the game weren't easy to test and were even harder to iron the bugs out of. And much of the early coding was done by an enterprising student at the University of Melbourne named Veronica Megler, who left the project midway through. As a result, the original version was known for being notoriously buggy, often in game-breaking ways. Even the final build has its share of jank, and playing with a guide will only get you so far. Beam Software later produced 3 Lord of the Rings text adventures that came out in 1985, 1987, and 1989, but only the first 2, The Fellowship of the Ring and Shadows of Mordor, were released in the UK by Melbourne House, while the final chapter, The Crack of Doom, was published by Addison Wesley Publishing Company for the North American market only. These 3 games are generally considered less interesting than The Hobbit because they play like more straightforward adventures with no random elements, and they also tend to dip in quality as they go. I would only recommend them to hardcore Tolkien fans. Speaking of the Lord of the Rings, another game developer arose in the early 1980s taking a clear inspiration from Tolkien's books, though unlike Beam Software, they didn't have the license to use the property. The developer in question is Level 9 Computing, a software company founded by 3 brothers that had its own interpreter system and text compressor and thus was able to do some interesting and clever things with the games they created. Their initial trilogy of text-based adventures, known as the Middle-earth Trilogy, was later renamed Jewels of Darkness when Level 9 stripped out all of the Tolkien references for subsequent releases because they didn't actually have the license to use it. The first game in this trilogy, Colossal Adventure, doesn't win points for originality in name or theme, and it's a pretty blatant ripoff of Will Crowther's game with some dwarfs and elves thrown in for good measure. But it does have one interesting wrinkle. The game was advertised to have 200 rooms to visit, but could only be coded into a total file size of 32 kilobytes, and this necessitated making about 70 of the rooms areas you rushed through as a massive flood churned behind you. Some people really love this series, but I'm personally not a huge fan of the fantasy games that Level 9 created. They're interesting for their time, but in my estimation, they also don't hold up terribly well today. But their other major series, known as Silicon Dreams, has become a favorite of mine. It was published between 1983 and 1985. This series began with a game called Snowball, and it advertised having 7,000 different rooms to visit, which made it seem unbelievably massive. It's mostly a trick, though. 6,800 of these rooms involve walking around the corridors of an enormous colony spaceship full of hibernating people. The ship is called Snowball 9 because it's hauling a giant shell of ammonia ice around its hull. On the way to a new planet called Eden, something goes wrong, and literal sleeper agent Kim Kimberly is woken up to stop a rogue crewmate who's murdered the rest of the crew and started sabotaging the ship. Kim Kimberly prevails, but the ship's robotic crew mistake her for the hijacker, and she escapes to Eden ahead of them in the second game, oddly titled Return to Eden, despite the fact that the Snowball 9 is in orbit around the planet. Kim's quest this time is to stop the malfunctioning robots and confused crew above the Snowball 9 from crashing the ship and killing all the colonists aboard. But she also has to navigate the strange world of Eden, which is populated by robots sent to prepare things for the colony ship, as well as indigenous creatures who have become hostile to the alien invaders. The third game, The Worm in Paradise, doesn't star Kim Kimberly, but instead takes place 100 years in the future in the dystopian city of Enoch. The citizens of this city live underneath a glass dome in what has become a totalitarian society run by machines. The people in Enoch are terrified of the world outside thanks to a government disinformation campaign. As a nameless but passionate citizen who realizes that the people of Enoch are being lied to, your job is to reveal the government conspiracy trapping everyone inside as you explore the city. It's part 1984 and part biblical account of the Garden of Eden, and it's truly an interesting game for its time. This trilogy is remarkable because these games present some rather serious science fiction storytelling, along with a surprising amount of depth and detail. Of the three, The Worm in Paradise is the most difficult because it has a timekeeping system that requires quests to be completed at certain times of the day, but it also has the most advanced text parser and some truly sophisticated puzzles involving color codes that change when you reload the game. Level 9's Silicon Dreams trilogy was initially self-published as standalone chapters, but both the Jewels of Darkness and the Silicon Dreams trilogy releases that debuted in 1986 were published by two imprints called Rainbird and Firebird, both owned by British Telecom. Rainbird itself was named after its founder, Tony Rainbird, and gradually focused on 16-bit prestige titles, while Firebird became known outside the UK as the imprint that handled foreign licensing. Rainbird and Firebird are both known for publishing the work of another prolific text-based adventure game developer called Magnetic Scrolls, and its first game, The Pawn, is considered a classic in the UK, and it was looked at as being the first game from across the Atlantic that might give Infocom a run for its money in the United States. But here in North America, The Pawn was such a non-event, it's pretty much forgotten. The Pawn launched in the UK in 1985, but it made a bigger impression in 1986 when it received a broader release in the UK and eventually the United States, with graphics added in. Now, one of my favorite writers on this era, Jimmy Maher, aka the Digital Antiquarian, even says it was one of the biggest releases of 1986, right up there with Leather Goddesses of Phobos. Absent sales numbers, I'm not sure, but I can point to Computer Gaming World's Top 100 Game Ratings table printed back in the 1980s where The Pawn didn't seem to register with readers in the US at all. That might be because the title was originally released in the UK in 1985 as QL Pawn for the Sinclair QL, a fairly obscure computer system that would ultimately be a failure for British computer maker Sinclair Research. The Pawn was ported to a wide variety of more popular platforms in 1986 in two different formats, a text-only version and a graphical version with some optional but extremely attractive high-resolution artwork. This helped to mask the fact that the adventure game itself was not particularly great at being an adventure. It was overly wordy, had some really nonsensical puzzles, and was built around the idea of being a satirical take on the adventure game genre rather than a serious fantasy adventure. Had it not been for the addition of graphics in the 1986 ports, I doubt anyone would have taken much notice of the game. In the UK, The Pawn received a lot of attention, and Magnetic Scrolls was being touted as the Infocom killer and the herald of a new era of adventure gaming. But by the time The Pawn was available in North America, Infocom itself only had enough gas for another year of text-only adventures and was about to pivot to illustrated adventure games. And from what I can tell from reviewing gaming publications of the day, Magnetic Scrolls never truly found a devoted fanbase outside of Europe. And that's too bad, because their next game, The Guild of Thieves, is actually a lot better than The Pawn, and if you're going to play one of them, it's the one I would start with. The premise of The Guild of Thieves is that you're trying to steal anything that's not tied down around an island castle. And while it's a pretty traditional text adventure game that feels a lot like Zork in its sensibilities, the nice graphics and above-average text parser make it a worthwhile experience. That same year, Magnetic Scrolls released another text-based adventure game called Jinxter, where the fun conceit is that you cannot die due to a strange occurrence that happens at the beginning of the game, where your life is saved by a mysterious savior described as a large, pot-bellied figure in a herringbone overcoat hovering a couple of feet above the pavement munching on a cheese sandwich. You discover that you've been pulled into a conflict involving angelic beings called guardians and evil witches, and your job is to defeat the evil high witch Janador by assembling a magical bracelet and replacing its 5 charms. Though the game takes place in a fantasy world called Aquitania, it's very modern and looks and feels quite different from the medieval fantasy world of The Pawn and the Guild of Thieves. There's also an interesting backstory to why this is. One of the development team members, Anita Sinclair, had her sister Georgina write the story for the game, which was originally titled Green Magic. And it was supposed to take place in a more modern time in the world of the earlier game. But they had a falling out during development, and Anita brought in her boyfriend, the writer Michael Bywater, to try to save the game in time for release. Michael Bywater is not a well-known writer outside of the UK, and despite his talent as an extremely acerbic comedy writer, he spent most of his career begrudgingly in the shadow of his famous friend, Douglas Adams. These two fellows not only went way back to before either of them was famous, but Douglas Adams even based his detective character Dirk Gently on Michael Bywater. The two also had an interesting connection in the realm of interactive fiction. When Douglas Adams bailed on Infocom's game Bureaucracy, at Adams' suggestion, Michael Bywater was brought in to try to save the game, and for better or worse, he did. And so, when Anita Sinclair asked Michael Bywater to punch up green magic, he decided to rewrite all of the text in the game, and more amazingly, he did it in a 3-week binge and then gave the game its new name of Jinxter, both a reference to the game itself and also the situation surrounding it. The result was a wonderfully snarky and humorous game, but also one that is known for being incredibly cruel to the player. I won't spoil anything here, but if you do play it, be prepared to be surprised, and also have a walkthrough handy once the game cuts your legs out from under you the first time. Magnetic Scrolls released 3 more games through Rainbird. Corruption is from 1988 and involves working at a stock brokerage and discovering that the place is corrupt. And it's probably the most serious of any of their games, with a thriller-style storyline. Fish is an interesting game, also from 1988, where you play as an extra-dimensional being who begins the game in the body of a goldfish before battling a group called the 7 Deadly Fins to save the water-filled world of Hydropolis. It's definitely funny in places, but so wacky and irreverent, it's pretty hard to take it seriously when the game shifts into more of a save-the-world vibe in the final act. And then there's Myth, a similarly humorous game from 1989 set in the realm of Greek mythology. You play as Poseidon, and you have to travel into the underworld and steal the Helmet of Invisibility from Hades. It's a short and easy game because it was only distributed through a mail-order games club called Official Secrets. But much like Infocom, Magnetic Scrolls couldn't keep simply producing text parser games without adding a graphical user interface to suit the desires of players. And so they created a windowed environment for their next game, 1990's Wonderland, which allowed players to have access to toolbars, a map, a graphics pane, and a text parser pane. It has a fairly straightforward story based on the novel Alice in Wonderland and accessible puzzles that provide a moderate level of challenge. On the other hand, its overlapping mess of Microsoft Windows 3.0 style graphics mean it's aged really poorly, and when you compare it to the likes of The Secret of Monkey Island and King's Quest V, Absence Makes the Heart Grow Yonder, which also came out in 1990, it just doesn't hold up that well today. Beyond the 4 studios I've mentioned, there are a few others that produced a lot of text-based adventures in the 1980s. One of the most prolific was CRL Group, which debuted in 1982 with the Save the Princess text adventure game Rescue, and then started cranking out many more text adventures, most notably horror games like Dracula, Frankenstein, Jack the Ripper, and Wolfman, all of which earned the attention of censors at the BBFC, the agency we know today as the British Board of Film Classification, and they were rated as being appropriate only for older gamers. Another interesting duo from this era is Mel Croucher and Christian Penfold. Their company, Automata UK Limited, was known for creating games that pushed a lot of boundaries and thus got plenty of attention. Pie Mania debuted in 1982 and provided players with a surreal text adventure that also offered clues to the location of an actual golden sundial treasure in the real world, in the tradition of the 1979 treasure hunt book Masquerade. An additionally interesting aspect of this game is that the cassette on which it was stored could be flipped over so players could hear the utterly odd Pie Mania song. And by the way, you can find a link to it in the show notes. Automata also created an odd 1983 text adventure called My Name is Uncle Groucho, You Win a Fat Cigar, which contained a team-up of a character not so loosely based on Groucho Marx and Pie Man trying to identify Hollywood stars. This game also had a contest, and the player who could correctly identify the final mystery personality won a trip to Hollywood to meet that star. Spoiler alert, it was Mickey Mouse. We could probably devote an entire podcast to all of the other text-based adventures you could find in the UK, particularly on cassette. And part of the reason for that was because of a piece of software originally written for the ZX Spectrum called the Quill, designed by Graham Yandell and published by Gilsoft in 1983. This program was responsible for the creation of hundreds of text-based adventures that were sold commercially in the 1980s, and it not only received expansions to add in illustrations, compression, and better performance, but it also got a sequel in 1989 called Professional Adventure Writer, on which hundreds more commercial games were authored. You might wonder, how did so many amateur developers create commercial games with DIY software? Well, in short, it's because the UK had a more concentrated population of computer users than the United States, and also a strong print media ecosystem for would-be developers to advertise their wares, creating a strong market for niche releases. Unfortunately, the UK also had a considerable problem with software piracy, and so it's doubtful that most of these would-be developers made much money on their endeavors. Another DIY game that struck a similar chord, but this time across the Atlantic, is Eamon, more properly known as the 1979 freeware Apple II RPG, The Wonderful World of Eamon by Donald M. Brown at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. While Eamon was and still is a role-playing game, its emphasis on exploration and modular scalability allowed players to create their own interactive fiction stories within the game, and Donald Brown encouraged players to do it. He wrote 2 initial adventures and then worked with a few regular collaborators such as Jim Jacobson and John Nelson to add additional expansions. Eventually, Nelson's National Eamon Users Club and the later Eamon Adventurers Guild helped to preserve and index the canonical adventures of the Eamon series, with the most recent, The Wayfarer's Inn from October 2023, being the 280th entry. Today's text-based adventure scene is online and fairly fragmented, and I suspect that the current interest in generative AI has taken a lot of the interest out of creating the types of adventures that users have traditionally considered high-quality interactive fiction. I actually think there's some cool potential to train generative large language model AI on some of these adventures and let it guide you through them by translating your spoken or typed sentences into something that an older text parser can understand. But that's another story for another time. One of the big decisions to make if you want to play or create text-based adventures on modern hardware is which environment to use. Some interpreters only really work with older formats like the Infocom Z machine, and thus a modern interpreter like Frotz is really best used for playing those older titles on a modern PC or mobile device. One popular freeware authoring tool is called TADS, and it can also be used as an interpreter for many interactive fiction formats. And general-purpose emulators like ScumVM also have implementation built in for many interactive fiction formats. The main repository for interactive fiction games today is the Interactive Fiction Archive. There's a link in the show notes. And if you're interested in modern creators, this is the place to go find them. One of the most celebrated games in recent years is called Type Help by William Roos, and it's very much in the style of modern games like The Root Trees Are Dead, Her Story, and The Return of the Obra Dinn, where you have to piece together a story from a bunch of oddly labeled files on an old disk drive. Another is the 2012 game Counterfeit Monkey, written by Emily Short. It's a game that revels in wordplay, and the tools you can pick up allow you to do things like shave letters off the names of objects to transform them into something else, or add or change or rearrange letters for a similar effect. Even better, the game has multiple solutions for many of its puzzles. Going back a little further in time, the 1998 interactive fiction game Anchorhead by Michael Gentry has long been considered one of the best games in the entire genre of text-based adventures. Even better, it's free to play, and there's even a $10 paid 20th anniversary illustrated version you can get on itch if you want to support the creator. The story is essentially a big love letter to the work of H.P. Lovecraft, and it even takes place in Massachusetts in a town called Anchorhead that's full of dark secrets and hostile residents who are all hiding something. There are also NPCs who can help you if you ask them the right questions. But the game's particularly well regarded for its atmosphere, from the weather effects to the slow-burning plot to the wonderful, evocative writing that adds to the growing sense of dread. It's a great game, and if you're even remotely interested in text-based adventures, you really need to play it. Beyond all of this, there's one more topic I want to briefly address, and that's MUDs, also known as multi-user dungeons. There was a time when MUDs were one of the primary ways to play online games with other users on large networks, such as college campuses or over the early internet. Because they were designed to be terminal programs run through a program such as Windows Telnet, MUDs have long been non-graphical affairs that use text parsers to allow players to interact with the world. While these games have as much to do with older mainframe RPGs as they do with Will Crowther's adventure, they're an interesting branch of the genre of interactive fiction because they're built for multiplayer text-based interactions, often involving the same sorts of navigation and object manipulation mechanics as single-player adventure games, and, believe it or not, they're still attracting players today. I'll talk about MUDs in a lot more detail in another episode one day, but if you can imagine it, there's probably a MUD for it. In preparation for this episode, I found a Star Wars one I tinkered with for a while, and it was not only filled with 16 different planets to visit, but also 100 playable races and multiple storylines. But I think we've covered text-based adventures well enough for now, and I hope some of the games that I've recommended are of interest to you. Our next step, of course, is to talk about graphical adventure games, and we'll cover Ken and Roberta Williams, as well as many other pioneers of the graphical side of the genre, in our next episode of The Great Game Guide. If you enjoy this show, you can read this series every week on my Substack at greatestgames.substack.com, where you'll also find brand new articles on other great games you've never played. And you're always welcome to talk with me on Bluesky. I'm Sean Jordan, I'm your Great Game Guide, and I'll be back next week with even more to explore. Before I let you go every week, I'm going to close out the show with a game I want you to try that's a little off the beaten path. This isn't sponsored content, and I don't have any financial stake in anything I recommend. These are games that I think are really good, but don't have as much exposure as some of the more popular ones. This week, I want to recommend Mouthwashing, which is a tremendously interesting psychological horror game from 2024 by Wrong Organ, a Swedish developer. It's not a very long game, you can finish it in 3 or 4 hours on your first playthrough, but it is definitely a game you should experience because it tells a very strange and sad story about a doomed starfreighter crew in a way that really begs to be experienced firsthand. So I'll do my best here to stay spoiler-free, but here's the basic setup. A skeleton crew ship carrying interstellar freight gets into a collision thanks to the actions of the ship's captain, and the survivors are left to try to figure out what to do now that their vessel is drifting through space. None of them really trust each other, and one of them has been so badly maimed by the accident he's wrapped in bandages and stuck in sickbay, where he has to be given oral medication regularly to alleviate the pain from the terrible burns he received. The present-day story is frequently interrupted by flashbacks, dreams, and fantasy sequences that help you to understand how things got to where they are. But the real surprise comes from how you begin to feel about each of the characters as you get to know them better, and also how you feel about yourself as your own actions become clearer. The game's got an interesting PlayStation 1 era look to it, but it feels a lot more modern in how it plays as what's largely a first-person adventure game that contains a couple of sequences where you have to be stealthy. It's full of surprises, some thrown in just for shock value, and others that are part of the deeper story that the game is trying to tell. And I will say this for Mouthwashing, the game is never boring, because just when you think you have a handle on things, everything changes. You can get the game on Steam for about $13 at regular price, but it's not hard to find it on sales or in bundles. Don't miss out. It's a tremendously good game that's great for a long night or a weekend where you just want to play something from start to finish. The Great Game Guide is a podcast written by me, Sean Jordan, and I also wrote the theme music. This is all 100% human-created content. I don't use AI for any part of my production. This episode is copyright 2026 by me, Sean J. Jordan, and you can find more details in the show notes and on my website at greatestgames.substack.com. And credit where it's due. Any games, artwork, sources, or additional music are the property of their respective owners, used under fair use guidelines and also noted in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please let me know on Substack, Bluesky, or with a nice review. But I'd appreciate it even more if you'd share it with a like-minded friend. Thanks for listening!